Thank you so much, Betty, and thank you to Cultural Policy Center and Harris School for having me this afternoon. It's always great to be back on the campus of U of C. So has the word diversity run its course? Has the emergence of a diversity industry, and arguably of a diversity orthodoxy, commodified and somehow paralyzed our understanding of individual and group differences, cultural identities, pluralism, and equal rights? Local and national crises that are fostered by interracial, interethnic, or interreligious tensions inevitably incite conversations about managing relationships between recognizable groups of people. Appeals are made to the rights and responsibilities of shared citizenship, and the gods of corrective intervention summon an army of enlightened professionals eager to hoist the flag of multiculturalism and extol the many virtues of diversity. Out of many we are one, or out of many we are many. Either way, it doesn't matter, so shut up and hug. For the record, I am a liberal pluralist who hoists the flag all the time. And yet, despite our good intentions, pundits and politicians will decry the failure of multiculturalism. They will pen obituaries announcing the death of the multicultural experiment. And they will ridicule multicultural practices that aim to celebrate differences without judging and evaluating those differences. Questions will arise as to whether nation states can and should integrate cultures that have been deemed alien to Western cultures, outside the American cultural consensus, or just plain scary and weird. My video play, Multi Meets Poly, is not about any one particular conflict, community, or dynamic. It's about how we construct culture, understand difference, and manage interaction. In writing this video play, I set out to reflect upon the theoretical and practical differences between two powerful social ideas, multiculturalism and polyculturalism. I chose to personify these ideas as human characters, one male, one female, and to endow each character with professional rivalry, intellectual one-upmanship, and sexual tension. A would-be romantic evening becomes the vehicle for exploring American interpretations of cultural pluralism, interchange, and diversity. But why this conversation? Why is my theater company, Silk Road Rising, grappling with these two particular ideas? For years, I have been saying that Silk Road Rising was born of a multicultural politic and then migrated to a polycultural aesthetic. We showcase playwrights and protagonists of Asian and Middle Eastern backgrounds. The artistic, cultural, and political realities that have necessitated African American theater companies, women's theater companies, LGBT theater companies are very much in sync with why we exist, giving voice to the historically voiceless and marginalized, and creating representation that aligns with the communities that are being represented. That's multicultural theater, carving out distinct spaces for distinct cultures and voices. However, we quickly realized that the stories we most want to tell, by and large, are the stories that intersect Silk Road peoples with non-Silk Road peoples. And yes, we have coined our own identity politic around the historic Silk Road. We want to explore how cultural interchange affects characters and narratives. The Japanese national with the African American, as in Philip Kangotanda's play, Johann. The American-born Armenian with the Dominican immigrant, as in Adriana Savan-Nichols' play, Night over Erzinga. The Indian American with the African American, as in Rajiv Joseph's play, The Lake Effect. The Lebanese-born Palestinian with the American Jew, as in my play, Precious Stones. All examples of polycultural theater. It is these sort of intersections that speak most vividly to us. And it is and by the way, just out of curiosity, who here has been to our theater company, to Silk Road? Okay, great. It is the dialogue and the tension between multiculturalism and polyculturalism that in so many ways is emblematic of the work that we do. Our art making and our community engagement live in a multi-poly continuum. Bear in mind that Multi Meets Poly is a video play, and while the definition of the term video play is still evolving for us, it is important to note that it is neither a filmed play nor a feature film, but rather a marriage of genres. A video play is a hybrid of theatrical language and design aesthetics enacted on a theatrical stage, conveyed through a cinematic lens, and engaged on a monitor or at public screenings. It is conceived for the stage, interpreted filmically, then rendered online and at public forums. Furthermore, Multi Meets Poly should not be viewed as entertainment so much as a theatricalized intellectual workout. It is not narrative storytelling in the traditional sense, but rather a rigorous and hopefully compelling exercise in probing two important ideas through a medium that I call pedagogodrama. I think we coined the term. Pedagogodrama is drama intended primarily as a teaching and learning tool. We are not asking you to be passive spectators when watching the piece. We are asking you to be engaged thinkers. It is more lean forward than lean back. The ideas in this video play do not simply inform the story. They do not function as mere subtext to the story. The ideas are the story. As a writer, I have grown increasingly drawn to the notion of dramatizing ideas and dramatizing discursive argument, not as stealth messaging, but as the basis for constructing a story. The running time of Multi Meets Poly is approximately 34 minutes. It will be immediately followed by reactions to the piece by Professor Shweder, and then we will open up the conversation to all of you. And so with no further ado, I give you Multi Meets Poly.
It's a simple fact. Multiple cultures can coexist in one country, and they do.
Absolutely.
Each culture is to be afforded respect and recognition.
Of course.
Without hierarchies, without judgment, without bullying.
I love your optimism, but cultures are embodied by human beings.
Precisely. And human beings see difference. My job is to realign how they see difference.
We exist to illuminate, not dictate.
I employ a two-pronged strategy. A, I safeguard the integrity of each individual culture. And B, I guarantee that the relationships between cultures are peaceful and equitable.
We're ideas, not mandates. Culture is dynamic. It changes and evolves.
You want to understand me. Talk to the Canadians. Canada is my laboratory. Nobody understands me better than the Canadians.
I am so gonna give you a run for your money in Canada. They're starting to notice some of the cracks in your portfolio.
I wouldn't hold my breath if I were you.
Scared of a little competition?
The proof is in the pudding. I work as a matter of policy and practice.
It's quite a legacy.
And you? Polyculturalism. What can you boast?
I prefer my cultures flexible and open.
Flexible or diluted?
Strong enough to take risks and think outside the box.
Then why does the status quo fear me and not you?
The status quo has assimilated you, multiculturalism. You've become cosmetic, a photo op, a Benetton ad.
Art imitating life. Life imitating me.
I don't want to be an imitation. I'm more interested in the interchange of cultures.
You are a ripple in my stream of consciousness.
I'm fascinated by what happens when cultures intersect and overlap, merge and collide. I'm not about cultures fossilizing themselves. I'm about cultures reinventing themselves in relation to other cultures.
Now tell me something I didn't say first. Cultural transformation. That's my domain. You get subsumed within my larger thesis.
Which I am building upon.
Where then are your bricks and mortar?
Well, I'm a critique of you and a defense of me.
You do know you're one of my footnotes. You've been traipsing around, posing as my heir apparent. Multiculturalism 2.0, my logical conclusion.
Some say I replace you. Others say I correct you. I say I complete you. Your natural culmination.
Adorable. You are not my sequel.
So you're a whiskey man.
Authentic Kentucky bourbon.
Next time, I'll host and indulge you in this delectable California champagne I just discovered.
Champagne comes from Champagne, which is in France, not California.
Can you believe this is finally happening? You and me, here?
It's quite an honor for you, no doubt.
Look at this collection. You have a most impressive library.
We don't exist without books now, do we?
You've inspired volumes. I'm barely in print.
I wonder why.
But here we are. Two hot ideas on a first date.
Two hot ideas. One of us is rather obscure, wouldn't you say?
I like to think I'm emerging.
Emerging into what? For the record, this is not a date. Yet.
Excuse me? Join me for a little discourse. I know what that means.
You have been polemicizing against me.
It's what ideas do, no? Discursive battle? I thought I was flirting with you.
Notice who isn't responding.
You asked me out.
I scheduled a meeting. But if you were to stop being so objectionable.
What can I say? I'm passionate. I'm like you, multiculturalism. I see a big world out there comprised of hundreds of cultures.
I see hundreds of cultures. You see one big blur.
I see motion graphics. You see still photos.
I think you're a charlatan, Polyculturalism. An unsubstantiated idea vying for attention at my expense. And I certainly don't appreciate you stealing my Greek name, Poly. Plagiarism does not become you.
Multi, with all due respect.
You could dispel my suspicion.
I can teach you things too, you know.
Teach me.
I'm more original than you think. Music. Music is one of my favorite incubators. Right now, I'm all about Iraqi music. Some crazy good stuff.
I'm a great admirer of Arabic music.
As am I, but Iraqi music is not always Arabic. It can be Kurdish, Assyrian, Turkmen, Armenian, Hebrew.
Thank you for the cultural geography lesson. I guess I have a blind spot when it comes to me. Get real, teacher.
You have been studiously avoiding me. You've publicly denied ever hearing of me. Why today? Why now?
The idle chatter of the intellectual classes managed to put a bug in my ear. Go figure. That bug would be you.
Charming. I see you're keeping up with your critics.
A great idea always has critics. Critics are lightweights. You need to be rereading me. I don't segregate cultures. I don't cordon off communities.
Whoa! I am here with an enormous amount of respect for you and your work. My very inception I owe to you. I wouldn't exist without multiculturalism.
You said that I sequester cultures in their own little silos, trap people in hermetically sealed cultural ghettos.
February is African American Month. March is Women's History Month. May is Asian American Month. September 15th through October 15th belongs to Latinos. I'm sorry, it's problematic.
As opposed to all 12 months belonging to white folk.
You had your month, now go away. We ate your kebabs at Taste of Chicago. We watched you Mamba at Lincoln Center. We caught your textile exhibit at the Smithsonian. Oh, I just love those exotic beads you sell.
Better everyone be erased or be appropriated by the white man.
You gerrymander cultures into these constructed little narratives through which to interpret the world. As an Asian American, from a Latino perspective, as a Black man in America. Gee, thanks for the vote of confidence.
I create space for each culture to count, to matter, to flourish and contribute on its own terms.
Yes, and I thank you for that. I am in awe of you for that. You and I, we have a lot in common.
You were my carbon copy, till you started meddling with the keyboard.
For starters, we both detest cultural assimilation.
Good old cultural assimilation. You'd have thought he'd have tired by now, but no. The old geezer still thinks he can beat me. Poor guy.
We scoff at the mere mention of cultural normativity. We're the sworn enemies of cultural imperialism.
Remind me to share my war stories with you someday. I have the scars to show for it. But you should see the other guys.
We thrive where there's a variety of cultures.
I have changed the entire world. I have transformed our cultural landscapes. I have reimagined how cultures perceive each other, speak to each other, relate to each other.
But it's all kind of engineered. I'm coming at this from a more holistic place, more integrative, more organic.
Are you now? I'm sure people of means and trust fund babies love you. Organic. May I have a side of your finest grass-fed, locally sourced polyculturalism to go with my privilege, please? What about equality? Visibility, representation.
Great. Now everyone can have their own cable television network, maybe their own beauty pageant. You erect borders and you police boundaries.
Police. I create inclusion regardless of race or ethnicity or language or creed.
Separate but equal doesn't work.
Who said anything about? I represent the mosaic, not the melting pot.
To hell with mosaics and melting pots. I want open borders.
Reality check. Cultures have integrity. Cultures have specificity, meaning.
They're a work in progress. Don't you see you've opened this door to cultural relativism? Swapping biological determinism for cultural difference still has the same effect. It's no longer polite to talk about the size of their brains or the shape of their foreheads. Instead, we're going to talk about their culture. It explains away everything. Sexism, violence against women, homophobia, classism. Shh, we need to respect their culture.
Right, I'm a relativist. How convenient. Funny how ills that exist in all cultures only get projected on despised cultures, usually as a pretext for abusing and exploiting those cultures.
Defending patriarchy in the name of
Cultures change from within in accordance with their own values and their own needs. External force never creates change, it creates resistance.
Yes, but your methodology doesn't acknowledge that cultures can change from within. You keep cultures under permanent lockdown to feed your insatiable appetite for all these eternal differences you concoct.
Is German culture superior to Nigerian culture?
Whoa. That's your pissing match, not mine. My cultures don't compete, they collaborate.
Your entire MO is dodgeball.
A, how do you measure superior? B, which German culture versus which Nigerian culture? And C, what is the proximity between these German and Nigerian cultures?
Hard to be held accountable in a world of hypotheticals.
It's not hypothetical. Cultures are not static, not fixed. You see everything through these hegemonic lenses. Black people live in their bodies, Asians live in their minds. White people divide their bodies from their minds.
No, so now I peddle stereotypes.
Identities are fluid and malleable and situational, not immutable.
I am the king of identity politics. You're gonna tell me.
Cultures don't come in black and white. They come in gray.
Cultures have distinct histories and narratives.
A culture is the sum total of all the cultures it has encountered, plus all the cultures it has yet to encounter. There is no finish line in culture.
Have you any idea what America was like before me? Everyone had to fit into Mayberry. But if you didn't look like Mayberry, speak like Mayberry, Mayberry didn't want you.
So we changed Mayberry.
We. I so appreciate your aspirational eloquence. You're a one-woman clarion call. But dare I say, I'm a lot more sophisticated than you are, Polly. Infinitely more pragmatic, hence effective. I empower entrepreneurs, innovators, artists, rock stars, because I practice the art of the possible. You dream the impossible dream. Mine is the world of realpolitik, and yours is a conclave of motivational speakers. I understand that change is incremental, not elastic, which is why I'm strategic and you're sporadic. You see, I'm a revolutionary when need be, and I'm a reformer when need be. One day I demand absolutism. Next day, I'm negotiating a compromise. Style switching comes second nature to me. Idealism without realism produces heartbreak. I keep my eye on the prize. Better, more multicultural world.
A little humility goes a long way.
I stand with the oppressed and the downtrodden, the powerless, the marginalized, the outcasts.
Great. But should our final destination always be the pity party? Are we here to liberate cultures or create a permanent victim class? I think there's something deeply colonial about your thinking.
Colonialism is your forte, polyculturalism, not mine. The English trotted the globe having all sorts of polycultural experiences. They called it empire.
You can do a bait and switch on divide and rule, but it's still divide and rule. You want to dominate cultures? Keep them distrustful of one another. That's your stock and trade.
There's a reason everyone flocks towards me and not you. Governments, universities, businesses, organizations. I'm the king of social engineering.
Identity politics, social engineering. You have a king complex, don't you?
I have applied utility. I can be implemented. Can you? Can a state legislate polyculturalism? Can you be adapted for public policy?
No. That's the point. I'm a phenomenon, not a grand bargain.
Shines in theory, pales in practice. Even the leading business schools have conceded victory to this old radical.
You're proud of being useful to capitalism.
You want economic growth, access to new markets, a competitive edge globally, hire a diverse workforce.
Diversity is a beautiful thing, my friend, until it becomes a synonym for deflect. Pay no attention to those Wall Street robber barons trading in our futures. No. Look at our VP of marketing. She's African American.
The fact that she's African American and a she and in a position of power and building personal wealth actually matters a lot.
What? We should be advocating tokenism?
Fairness, leveling the playing field is not tokenism, is what we call progress. Forget it. Too real.
For a revolutionary idea, you sure have thin skin.
I don my armor for hypotheses that matter.
Armor's looking rather dull these days. Lost its luster.
More flirtation, I assume?
So we are on a date.
You are so out of your league.
What happened to that hopeless romantic I'd been busy deconstructing? And here I thought...
I exist in response to the world and to injustice. You exist in response to me.
Success sure can breed ego. Beautiful Moroccan rug you have here.
It's not Moroccan.
Yes, it is. Look at the black and white pattern. The irregular angles and square motifs, how they repeat.
It's made of synthetics. An esteemed colleague gave it to me as a gift. I couldn't refuse.
I'm beginning to detect a theme. You don't play well with others.
You have defamed me as an essentialist, a biological determinist, a multicultural imperialist.
We're a dialectic in progress.
That would presuppose an actual conversation.
Conversation presupposes that both parties are listening.
Cultures engage each other for mutual benefit, not to get lost in each other. We're not making smoothies. I dare to dream of racial harmony.
I'm not interested in racial harmony. I'm interested in ending racism. You're multicultural. I'm anti-racist.
Multiculturalism is anti-racism. Look at my DNA. You don't end racism by pretending race doesn't exist.
Or by freezing it in time.
How about respecting cultural authenticity?
Because it's a false construct. Culture is highly subjective.
Hypothesize till you are blue in the face. There's a reason cultures get passed on from generation to generation.
Like artifacts preserved in formaldehyde? Please. Each generation remakes its culture in its own image.
If you're black or brown in America, you're not allowed to forget it.
White American mother, Kenyan father. Born in Hawaii, raised in Kansas and Indonesia. Moved to Chicago, married an African American woman, America's first polycultural president, Barack Obama.
Barack Obama's mine. I made him possible. You can have Tiger Woods.
I already do.
The reason so many people on the right hate Barack Obama isn't because he's polycultural. It's because he's black. If you are not white in America...
You make everything about race. You place white people at the center of everything you do. Whiteness is the canvas upon which you paint your beloved people of color. I think you're kind of racist.
You, who never met a race you didn't want to blend
All sorts of synergy exists between Asians and Africans without a white person in sight.
Because Whitey is hiding behind the curtain, pulling the strings.
Not every portrait has a white master in it. Cultures do have agency.
Unless they are denied agency. White people need to be taught that they are one of many. They are not the one.
Then why not practice what you preach? Peoples of European background are one. We, of all ideas, should be refuting such nonsense, not advocating Fortress Europe.
It's time to play Parse the White People. Yay! Tell me, Miss Polly, where do you stand with rich whites? Because I have them exactly where I want them.
Au contraire, monsieur. They selected their own seats for your little joyride at the front of the bus. You're a great investment for rich white folk. That little extortion fee you charge them, small price to pay for keeping all their power.
My left-wing detractors have taught you so well. Sad how the left eats its own.
The only white people you battle are the poor whites and the working class whites. Marginalized whites. You ascribe them all this privilege and power. Privilege and power they don't have.
Whiteness is power.
Unless you're white and powerless. Multiculturalism. You failed poor whites and working class whites. Chase them away.
Or maybe the bigots in their ranks have been chasing me away.
Instead of giving voice to millions of disadvantaged whites, and they do need a voice, you manage to both vilify and erase them in one clean swoop.
White people have a seat at the table, just like everyone else.
Cultures tend to stagnate when they're staring at each other's differences from across the table. And again, you sure have built a lucrative business for yourself. Those high-paid diversity consultants who wear your badge, they love you.
My disciples are helping the world heal. It is because of me that an Indian kid, or a Chinese kid, or a Mexican kid
can be a statistic and not a human being. Unless you're half white, quarter black, and quarter Native American, and struggling to determine which box to check.
I shattered glass ceilings that were certifiably unbreakable.
You turned diversity into an industry, created marketing data for corporations, demographic polling for politicians, all the while casting doubt on the very people you set out to help.
I undid centuries of ingrained thinking. I rewired society's brain.
You actually believe your own rhetoric. You are a lot more bark than you are bite. Multiculturalism doesn't do squat for economic inequality. You wax poetic about inequality perched inside the very boardrooms that maintain inequality. Military-industrial prison complex, anyone? For-profit prisons, the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Time in the tank, a rite of passage for America's poor. 400 people control more wealth in this country than 50% of the population. 400 people. Is that fair? Most of the wealth in this country is inherited, and your response? A gutless redress you call affirmative action that leaves affirmative privilege entirely unscathed. Legacy admissions, trust funds, stock portfolios, property assets, liquidities. In America, we keep it all in the family, and you're not about to challenge that power.
In a perfect world, I too might be a polyculturalist. Wouldn't that be lovely? But this isn't a perfect world. My work is nowhere near being done.
I integrate, you separate. I invite, you appoint. I facilitate, you regulate. I ask, you tell. I embrace, you tolerate. I emerge, you impose.
In other words, I'm serious, and you're a suggestion. You're a helpful hint.
No, I'm a destination. You're a temporary way station. You see groups competing for resources, jockeying for power, demanding their due. I see human beings all working together.
Wow. Imagine that. World without history.
History is living. It's not archival.
Maybe in the kumbaya, Pollyanna America you live in.
Great things happen within cultures, absolutely. But the best things happen between cultures.
Or the worst. I enable each culture to represent itself. That is the secret to my success.
Tell me, how does a culture represent itself?
By speaking its own truth.
Yes, in relation to the culture it's representing to at that given moment.
Culture is not show and tell. It is not a spectator sport.
Says the Grand Marshal of the Macy's Day Parade. I bet our enemies love seeing us argue like this. Nationalism, xenophobia, sectarianism. They're laughing their guts out. Instead of tearing each other down, we should be building a united front against those who would destroy us both.
You love rattling off all our common enemies, but we're no Bonnie and Clyde in their eyes. You're harmless. An esoteric amusement. I'm the formidable foe.
Multi, baby, you need to venture outside your little echo chamber and re-engage some. Word on the street is that you're manageable and containable, whereas I am irreversible. That's scary stuff.
London. New York. Toronto. Sydney. Great multicultural cities. That dynamo can be traced directly to me.
Except today, they're polycultural cities. People started venturing outside their demarcated enclaves. Imagine that. Black people learning with Asian people, learning with Latino people, learning with Arab people, learning with white people, learning with black people.
Because I tore down the wall.
No, the people did. You're still trying to catch up.
Clean the wax out of your ears. Cast yourself as an addendum to me, and you'll be fine. Cast yourself as an alternative to me, and they will laugh you out of town.
Don't be so sure of that.
Maybe you'll inspire a few dissertations. You might even spawn a theater company or fashion line. Help tweak the McDonald's menus in Russia and Brazil, Korea. But you will never have the impact I have because you fail to grasp the single most important fact. The human animal is fundamentally tribal.
True. And the human animal is fundamentally curious.
Good luck on that one. As for that date that you were so keen on, what do you have going on this weekend? I hear there's this great Korean taco joint that just opened.
So, tribal and curious. The curious I refer to as the astonishment of anthropology. And I must say that this, of course, was great intellectual fun and is full of terrific one-liners, but it's much more than that. I have a former brother-in-law. I have many former brother-in-laws, by the way. I'm looking for a new kinship term for former brother-in-laws. It's a little simple one. Who did a dermatology residency, and he said to me at one point, Rick, you know, there are only two things you need to know to do dermatology. If it's dry, make it wet. If it's wet, make it dry. And I told that to an anthropology friend of mine who said, well, Rick, you know, there are only two things you need to know to do anthropology. If someone asserts it, deny it. If someone denies it, assert it. Which is that title for that seminar that Betty mentioned. And it seems to me this is the perfect example of an assertion-denial pattern that is meant to enable you to explore the complexity of a topic. I should also say that I view myself as a Confucianist, not a Confucianist, but a Confucianist. It's sort of a philosophy of scholarship and I suppose of life, and it's based on several tenets, but perhaps its most fundamental is that the knowable world is incomplete if seen from any one point of view, incoherent if seen from all points of view at once, and empty if you try to see it from nowhere in particular. So the choice in life, a tragic one undoubtedly, but it's the nature of embodiment and situatedness that there's a certain tragic aspect to it, is between incompleteness, incoherence, and emptiness. And faced with that choice, I can't pick incoherence, that's the end of all communication. Emptiness is a kind of dehumanizing distance that structuralists and maybe those inclined towards mathematical formulations like. So I choose incompleteness and try to stay on the move between different points of view, seeing each as a form of illumination and trying to remember what I learned. Wittgenstein has a kind of image you might develop in which you're on a tree, you sit on a branch with a saw in your hand, and you start sawing off the branch you're sitting on, but you look while you're sitting on that branch to see what you can see, and then you deconstruct it, move to the next branch, and you continue in a kind of eternal free fall. So I experience this as that kind of conversation, and I think it's a great achievement. I think it's, as a media, it probably is a media quite compatible with the philosophy of Confucianism. Years ago, during the summer, I was driving down a dirt road behind a Volvo station wagon, which had on the back of it a bumper sticker which said, "Celebrate Diversity." I was down behind that for quite a while, and I was sitting there as an anthropologist wondering what the person driving that car really meant when they said, "Celebrate Diversity." Because I was thinking about following them home and immediately grabbing them and interviewing them and saying, well, you know, I mean, I've worked in polygamous societies. How do you feel about polygamy? How about places where they think that both males and females should be circumcised? How about physical punishment for children? How about animal sacrifice? You know, how about rejecting all modern ways as the Amish do? You know, and I suspected that celebrate diversity really meant let everyone into my way of life. That it was just a matter of inclusion, not cultural diversity. It was some notion that people have been excluded from the one and single best way of life, which that person probably thought, eventually, I'm guessing, eventually would be the cosmopolitan universal way of life. So there you don't have what I would call a poly or multicultural view. The complexity is revealed when you look at someone like Samuel Huntington. Some of you may know Samuel Huntington's work and his book, which got and still gets an enormous amount of attention, The Clash of Civilizations. And he's interesting in part because he is a global multiculturalist. He doesn't believe the West is best and is going to take over the world. He believes that there's Chinese civilization and there's Indic civilization and there's Eastern Christianity, Eastern Orthodox, and all that's different they're different from each other. And he believes that the West is unique, not universal, but he's a domestic monoculturalist. He basically believes, you've got your civilization, let me have my Anglo-Saxon way of life, stop letting immigrants in who are going to erode that. There's a place for them in some other place. And so that's is a multicultural view, but you have to distinguish between thinking of it globally or thinking of it internally. a thought experiment, which I engage in. Indeed, I'm writing a book trying to think about this kind of problem. If you took all of the global diversity that anthropologists have studied, okay, and moved it into one domestic sphere, why would that be a problem? What would be the principles which would regulate what kind of diversity would be possible? Let's take the United States, which in fact is a pretty diverse society and in fact has a political structure, unlike many of the ethno-national states in Europe, that permits decentralization. I mean, our whole federal tradition and states' rights tradition favors a kind of diversification, and we have a much thinner view of citizenship, what it means to be an American, than someone in France has. Okay? You can't be French and wear a burqa in the public square or a headscarf in a public school. Okay? In the United States, we don't react nearly like that. Okay? So there's a thinner view, but what's on your un-American cultural activities list? Ask yourself that question. Is there anything on your un-American cultural activities list? How about that polygamy? Why is gay marriage okay but not polygamous marriage, for example? Why is male circumcision okay, not female circumcision? Ask yourself that question. So there's an enormous amount of complexity here. I want to do two things and stop, and we'll sit in front and have a conversation and take questions and so forth. First, I want to just read you a couple of paragraphs in which I tried to examine the meaning of the term multiculturalism. Polyculturalism is a new term for me, but in a way it's segmenting out part of what is packed into my notion of the diverse meanings of multiculturalism. And then I want to just give you a couple of examples of hyperbolic forms of both poly and multi, and then I'll stop. So I think it's not so surprising that the word multiculturalism is now widely viewed with suspicion, even among its proponents, in part because the word has become a slogan for so many, perhaps far too many, rather different and even contradictory sorts of educational and social movements and public policy agendas. There are multiculturalists who value group differences and want to preserve them. And we saw that, of course, a lot in this conversation. There are other multiculturalists who think group differences are the product of vicious discrimination within any truly just society, and group differences should be made to go away. And we saw that in this conversation. There are multiculturalists who think that the word multiculturalism means being a hybrid and actively promoting the erosion of borders or boundaries between groups, as well as the mixing up or integrating of things in marriages, in neighborhoods, in schools, and even cuisine. That Korean restaurant at the end, for example. There are other multiculturalists who think the word implies autonomy, in-group solidarity, the power to remain separate or pure, and the capacity to maintain boundaries or restore a distinctive way of life by means of marriage, neighborhoods, schools, and even by means of a defining an indigenous cuisine. Think of the 500 plus sovereign Native American nations in the country right now. I have sat on federal funding boards in which they give scholarships to Native Americans, and the Native American sovereign nations have insisted that there be a blood quanta criteria for an applicant for that fellowship. Goes quite in the opposite direction of the affirmative action inclusion agenda, okay, in which even talk of blood ends up being provocative and being seen as racist. Well, go look at your sovereign Native American groups who want tribal territories, local control, autonomy, reviving a cultural tradition, and believe in blood quanta criteria for membership. Okay. There are multiculturalists who use the word in an almost ironic sense to commend and promote the mainstreaming assimilation or inclusion of people of different colors or ancestries into the society and shared subculture of the American elite. Okay. And there are other multiculturalists who use the term to call on the mainstream elite to accommodate themselves to minority group differences in customs, values, and beliefs, and tolerate or even celebrate genuine cultural diversity. There are multiculturalists who are distressed by and deeply suspicious of the idea that members of different groups might differ from each other in typifying ways. They disparage all claims about group differences as stereotyping. We saw that in here. It's like if you're an anthropologist and you talk about something characteristic of a group, that might well get you in trouble, you know, as a stereotype. Okay. For other multiculturalists, the very concept of multiculturalism would have no point at all if it were not for the reality of real differences between individuals that arise by virtue of their membership in different and particular groups. And those multiculturalists are very suspicious of all forms of what they disparage as everybody loves Saturday night shallow humanism. And that was expressed here as well. Okay. This dilution that is seen taking place, the kumbaya attitude, and so forth. So that's the complexity of the concept. It seems to me that this production was brilliant in making almost every move and having every assertion, denial, pattern I could even conceive of. I suspect you do have to come out of a kind of academic subculture to follow this full argument. I mean, I view this as something, Jamil and I were talking, and I'm sure any person who's interested in watching this can find threads that they identify with or might pick up or think about. But to really go with the flow of this back and forth strikes me as deep inside academic discourse about diversity. Just a couple of few examples, and then I'm going to stop. Here's an example of polyculturalism, and you can see whether or not you feel good about this or not. I know some people who don't feel good about it. This is a story told to me by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz some years ago, a few decades ago, and he had a friend who went to Japan on a trip for the first time, at a time when the Japanese were very interested in the Christmas season in the United States and Europe. And there were all sorts of displays being built that had Christmas images in them. And this person walked into a department store somewhere in Japan where they had a Christmas display. And what was it? Santa Claus nailed to a cross. Think about that image. Very dramatic. I'm sure you can do a lot with it. That's polyculturalism. Okay? They sort of didn't quite get the coherency of the season. They saw it was a mosaic that just sort of picked up bits. Now, if it was deliberately a mosaic and they were really trying to do a kind of parody, you can see the force of it. But more likely, it was basically a cultural misunderstanding, okay, which takes on a kind of polycultural form. Or another story. This is more delightful in some ways. I told that, by the way, in a context in which there was a Japanese student who got very upset because this was seen as a kind of, the very description of it was seen as an indictment of Japanese because they didn't understand it. I told it in another context in which someone actually proposed that the reason that happened was because of the LR confusion. That it was, how did they put it? There was a way in which it was a misunderstanding of pronunciation of language. It'll come to me how they derived it. Santa Claus. Yeah, Santa Claus, not Santa Claus. Santa Claus. Okay. Someone was talking about Santa Claus and referred to him as Santa Claus, and somehow that got transmuted into putting Santa on a cross. Okay. Again, poly effects can happen in very strange ways. Okay. And often based on misunderstandings at one level or another. I have an Indian friend, a woman who was married to an American man, and her Indian father wanted to join the American Peace Corps. Okay. And so she decided she should become an American citizen, which she could do. She went through the immigration process so that her father could join the American Peace Corps. And at the final stage of immigration in New York, she goes in to sign one document after another. And finally, she gets to the point where the immigration officer says, "Do you swear that you will bear arms in defense of the Constitution of the United States?" And she says, "No, I won't do that." And the immigration officer is startled. He says, "What do you mean? Why won't you do that?" She said, "Well, I'm a pacifist. I don't believe in killing." And the irony, of course, is that her father was trying to do, she was doing this to get her father in the Peace Corps. Okay? And the officer said to her, "Well, who taught you that?" And she said, "Mahatma Gandhi." And the officer said, "Who's that?" And she said, well, he's a great Indian religious leader. And the officer said, well, you'll have to get a note from him. And she said, I can't, he's dead. Well, get a note from whoever took his place. Okay. There's a poly conversation in context that has many dimensions to it. Here's multi gone hyperbolic. Okay. I've already sort of intimated the hyperbole of multi when I was talking about blood quanta criteria and the sovereign nations. But I know an anthropologist who wanted to do his PhD thesis among the Maori in New Zealand. Okay. Happened to be a University of Chicago symbolic anthropology PhD student at the time, and it turned out that the Maori had a whole gatekeeping process if you wanted to do research, as many Native American groups do. You just don't walk in and act as though you're an individual and every person living there is an individual and there's free speech and freedom of association and you can do whatever you want if someone's willing. There's a control process and a management process of the kind referred to here, and you have to go through an approval process, a quite complex one. In this case, the Maori had a Maori who had an MA in anthropology from Oxford, who did the interviewing to decide whether you were going to be let in to do the research. And he had a problem with the symbolic anthropology school of the University of Chicago. Okay? And this had to be negotiated before you could even have access. So how my group's going to be represented when you do your research ends up being of major concern for these in-groups, some of them quite insular but aware, of course. They're interacting, cultures are interacting there, right there at that boundary, you're being vetted, okay? And are you going to, well, how are you going to represent us before we let you talk to us? So there are multiple levels going on here, of course. There's no resolution I'm trying for you. I'm just trying to elaborate on what I think is the content and dynamic that's going on in this conversation, which I think was quite terrific. Two final points, I'll stop, I'll be very brief. I mentioned to Jamil. Jamil comes from a background in which the Ottoman Empire is hardly a stranger. All of the mentions here of cultures in Iraq, in a way, is an invocation of the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire, which had 23 different languages spoken, and lots of peoples who actually did live together relatively peacefully for quite a while, did it by separation. I mean, there were the millets, and Jews were really happy in the Ottoman Empire after they were kicked out of Spain and Portugal. They lived there for a long time in Salonika and in Istanbul. They had local control. No one told them what their religion should be. No one told them what their gender relations should be. No one invoked principles of social justice. Over here were Serbs, over here were Armenians, over here were Turks, over here were Jews. You can go on and on, Greeks. You could go on. And before nationalism broke it all apart, you had decentralized control of cultural territories. And as long as you could exit and go off to one of those cosmopolitan centers like Baghdad or Damascus or Cairo, where a certain kind of mixing and creative thing could go on, it was a solution in a way for live and let live. Finally, there's this equality, economic equality issue. And I think it's important not to recognize the tension that exists between two values I suspect many of you share, which is equality and diversity. It's very hard to have both. If you're really going to be a multiculturalist, it's highly unlikely you're going to have economic equality, because groups have different conceptions of what's of value, of how they want to spend their time, of how they want to raise their children, of how they want to talk to their children. The Amish don't value intellectual labor of the type you do. They value manual work. Okay? You're not going to have an Amish ballet dancer. And if that's a great source of regret to you, okay, you're not a multiculturalist. Let me sit down.
I'm so glad you're asking that question. There's a definite gendered politic in the piece. And I sat with other arrangements. Poly as a man, multi as a woman, 2 men, 2 women, and this arrangement really made the most sense to me. And yes, it was sort of a nod to perhaps a stereotypical gender dynamic, but I thought that it sort of served the purposes of where polyculturalism is in relationship to multi, and also this idea of the sort of celebrated, tenured, comfortable professor and maybe the postdoc. You know, this sort of whatever kind of inequality we want to, you know, ascribe to that dynamic, and aligning it with a somewhat traditional gender dynamic. It made sense to me. It's because each time I tried changing it, it's like Poly came back as a woman and Multi as a man.
Similar vein, also when you're choosing, if you will, the general ethnic for each one, what was the process?
Well, you know, in the audition process, we saw so many great actors who came out for this piece, and at a certain point, me and the director, George Bajalia, who's actually studying anthropology at Columbia University right now, we struggled with white and black actors. And we kept thinking, if we cast one of the roles African American, we're taking a certain position, we're making a certain sort of race statement or racialized statement, and if we go Caucasian in either direction, and it became very kind of prickly for us. Like, how are we going to negotiate that? How are we going to talk about that, and does that become a whole other story? So the choice of a Chinese American multi, and incidentally, these are also actors that as our companies had a relationship with for some time, but the choice of Gordon, and then Virginia, who's of mixed Mexican and Caucasian and Native American ancestry, so somewhat racially ambiguous, I thought worked well for Poly. There's also another, you know, in our conversation historically on race in the US, it's such a black-white conversation, and when we look at kind of a 21st century, you know, ethno-racial landscape in this country, we're talking about kind of a shrinking white population, at least in terms of percentage, a somewhat stable African-American population, like 13-14%, and then the growing populations are Asian and Latino. So there was a bit of a nod to a shifting demographic reality and also conversation.
And then just follow up, is there any concern that you have the privileged Asian in the multi position as opposed to?
You know, there was, and we certainly talked about that. And we certainly, I think, you know, a lot of that history, when you look at kind of radical, maybe identitarian activism in like the late 60s, early 70s, the Asian American piece of that history has been largely forgotten. It's been largely omitted. And the fact that there was, you know, really a radical Asian American movement that was allied to the Black Civil Rights movement and so forth, I kind of wanted to honor that somehow, you know, and but then he became very comfortable, and he became very established, and he became very normative, and yeah.
I'd be interested in knowing what all of you think is the relative weight of the two voices in the discussion that went on. I mean, was it equal, or do you feel like the production favored one voice over the other? Totally balanced, no one won, no one came out on top?
They both won.
Okay.
I would say I like Poly better. Just I think that they're, I mean, it was remarkably balanced in terms of the arguments both made, and they made lots of sense. So I think you did a very even-handed with that. But there's something, and maybe it is rooted in the kind of corporate multiculturalism that was being articulated there. But somehow there's a more likable character in Poly, in my opinion. The multi is a little self-satisfied and.
Oh, yeah. Poly is definitely, like, I want to be friends with Poly, but I'm fascinated by multi too.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but I also thought that they both won. I think that in the end, neither of them was going to budge an inch. but poly was more likely.
And what do you make of his move to go out on their date to a poly institution?
I disagree. I think multi actually, and I don't know why, but I did get a sense that multi somehow had more of a presence. I think Poly made good arguments. I agree, I like her in general, but I don't know, there's something about it, and I can't put my finger on it, that I do feel like multi somehow came out on top. Partially also it might be the setting. I mean, they were in his apartment, and his books were surrounding everything, so.
I wanted to say that Poly resonated with me a lot more as like a second generation immigrant of like, okay, you're seeing a lot of the conflicts between cultures and like how do you try to reconcile a lot of those differences versus like the multi seem more like maybe like my parent saying like, you know, we have to preserve a lot of what's there and yeah, so I saw that juxtaposition of like multi is a little more dominant and just kind of thinking of like a lot of the rhetoric that older generations or first generation immigrants share. But then as like a second generation immigrant, Poly definitely stood out to me.
You know, it's interesting because what you're describing, we see so much in the theater, where what I would call gatekeepers of, you know, sort of community leaders, some oftentimes self-appointed or whatever, will be very, oh, you can't show that, or you can't say that, you can't, you know, that's airing dirty laundry, or that's, you know, and the second generation really hungry for that kind of critical gaze into, you know, an experience or whatever the case. So we're constantly having to negotiate that tension between. Yeah.
Did your degree in religious studies in any way inform this film? If so, to what degree?
Oh gosh, well that was a long time ago. But sure, you know, I think that this institution really informed the making of the piece, and this was something Betty and I were talking about earlier today. I like to say that University of Chicago, it sort of like takes your brain and it throws it against the wall and it splats all over the place, and then you spend the rest of the time sort of trying to put it all. But there's a way of thinking about theory and sort of the relationships between theories and that kind of interplay that I think probably very much lives in the text of the piece. And I think that, you know, questions of religious pluralism and also how religious traditions adapt to new environments, and that kind of interchange between culture and history and tradition and ritual and so forth. I think that for me, like my own, you know, I was raised in the Orthodox Church, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and I will oftentimes define myself as culturally Orthodox. So there's probably a lot of dogma and doctrine that I part company with, but there's a very powerful cultural resonance, icons and, you know, so forth. So I think that to me is kind of a polycultural approach to religiosity. And the Div School kind of represents that somehow. You know, I think it lives in.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I really like the chance to see this, and it made me think of so many things, as I like to look at the intersection of gender and religion and agency. And so as they're talking about theoretical ideas, I'd love to see this kind of spin off and talk about the clashes between the second wave feminism and the poly whatever kind of feminism and third wave you know, or religion as it's conceived. And as Anum brought up, there's so much there about intergenerational ideas, you know, so again, a lot of second wave feminists saying like, you young women can take so much for granted, so you don't understand the need for these gender affirmative action policies and this and that. And so people want to say, well, we don't need to make gender an issue. So I saw so many parallels. I'd love to see like a spin-off and considering religion and maybe gender more directly.
I'm reminded of an incident just came to mind, which I think exemplifies the poly potential. So I have a student, Heather Lindquist, who's been studying Somali refugees who moved into Lewiston, Maine. A very large number went to Lewiston, Maine in a very short amount of time. And this is just one little piece of it, but in the high school, all of a sudden, a fair number of Somali young women show up wearing headscarves into a school that has prohibited bandanas because of its association with gang activity. And very quickly, there is a cultural negotiator, and this is the United States, not France, so everyone's into free exercise of religion, and the government supports diversity in public schools, and they're able to negotiate that these girls are going to wear their headscarves. No problem. They do a lot more accommodation, in fact, keep prayer rooms and all sorts of things. But one of these Somali girls, as an act of solidarity, shows up one day wearing a bandana as a headscarf. And all of a sudden, the parents of the kids who want to wear bandanas are up in arms because they're not letting bandanas, but they're letting headscarves. How can you do this? This is unfair. This isn't socially just. And the Somali young women are supporting it by essentially being out there with headscarves worn as bandanas. So that's a kind of interaction that serves a political purpose in a very fascinating way. Yeah. It's 1:20.
I think
know
we're
we should go,
at
right?
our end. Is there? Thank you so much for this.
Thank you very much.